Good evening, friends. Welcome to Pendle Hill. So nice to have you here on this Labor Day. Thank you for coming out on a holiday. For those of you for whom it was a holiday, I know that we are welcoming the Quaker Voluntary Service here, and for them it is a mandatory appearance. We are not being live streamed tonight because our internet has gone down again. And so we are nonetheless filming this for future viewing, which will be up on our YouTube channel, which is Pendle Hill USA. I like to get my commercials in early. There are a couple of things that are coming up at Pendle Hill fairly quickly that I would like to draw your attention to. We have a one-day program called Forage and Feast. We have two ethnobotanists and clinical herbalists who were affiliated with the University of Pennsylvania and are young folks who are incredibly talented about foraging, and they're going to do a tour of the Pendle Hill campus searching for edibles, and will actually teach us a lot about plants, and at the same time will gather the edible plants and then prepare a feast at John Marjorum's and Ann Jerome's home at Edge Hill on September 16th. That's a Saturday, 11 to 3. We have the final session of our gardening apprenticeship program with Ben Weiss, who has done our permaculture courses here as well as organic gardening courses, and that 4 successive Thursdays from September the 14th through the 26th of October, putting the garden to bed and preparing it for next year's planting. And of course, our very important social justice through economic resistance conference with a sliding scale. We're looking to have lots of folks. I hope some of you who are going to remain in the Philadelphia area can participate. That's September 21st through the 24th. Registration is ongoing. We have with us Dilip Baum, Kate Aronoff. Maybe many of you read her columns in The Nation, New Republic. We have the Reverend Gregory Holston, and we have nurses who are engaged in the organization of nurses at Temple University and their strike that was successful. So we have people who are looking at economic boycotts, divestment, sanctions, labor strikes. What are the tools that might be used in a nonviolent response to some of the injustices that we are witnessing here and around the world? If you have questions about that, you may address them to Lena Blunt, our new education coordinator. I'm appearing before you this evening as communications and outreach coordinator, but I'm still maintaining responsibility for the Monday night lectures, to which we will go right now. It's a great pleasure to welcome all of the new volunteers for the Quaker Voluntary Service and their leadership, and particularly to welcome Christina Repoley, who is both the founder and the current executive director of Quaker Voluntary Service, without which none of us would be here this evening. I think the vision, that may be a good thing. I'm hoping you'll look at it that way. Christina is a graduate of Guilford College, a member of Atlanta Friends Meeting. She has a Master's of Divinity degree from Candler Seminary at Emory University, and she serves on the board of directors of Friends Fiduciary Corporation and the advisory board of the Peace Builders Camp at Koinonoa Farm. She has written widely for Friends Journal. She delivered the 2014 Philadelphia Yearly Meeting William Penn Lecture, which is devoted to a young adult Friends reflections and commentary, and that has been published. And she was also Guilford's 2014 commencement speaker. She lives in Atlanta with her husband and children, and we're delighted she can be with us this evening to talk about coming alive, discerning the next chapter of Quaker service. So there'll be both a retrospective look at some of where the inspiration for our Quaker faith in action comes from, our service component. I was thinking this evening earlier about how Quakerism is not a set of beliefs that you adhere to, but a set of understandings about how the world is that you grow to learn, understand, and absorb as your own through the process of living and serving other people. So it's both a spirit-led religion and an experimental religion. And so I think what Christina has to share with us tonight about how that experiment is living and moving in young adults, both friends and seekers today, and how that affects the longevity, the sustainability, the growth, and vitality of the Religious Society of Friends generally will be of interest to all of us. So would you like to speak out of the silence, or would you prefer to just begin your address? Thank you.
Thank you, John. Thanks so much for being here, and especially for those of you who are not required to be here, thank you for coming. Tonight is the end of the first full day of orientation for our 2017-2018 Quaker Voluntary Service Fellows. This is the 6th orientation for QVS, so we're really excited to be here, and especially excited to be here at Pendle Hill, which is, has been a place of training and going forth into the world for decades and decades of Friends service. And I know some people in this room were here for your orientation for Quaker service that then set you on a path for your life. So it's really, we feel the history and the presence and the spirit in this place particularly. So we're really glad to be here. Last night, we did a go-around when we were meeting each other, the fellows and the staff last night, and we heard from our new fellows about why they chose to spend this next year of their lives with QVS, working for social justice in the context of spiritual community. And there were a lot of similarities in the answers that we heard. And a lot of what folks said was that they wanted to be in community, in an environment where they could intentionally explore their spiritual lives and be supported and do important, meaningful work in the world. We had a joke earlier about meaningful work, but truly, I think the fellows here really want to be doing meaningful work. And I think it probably goes without saying that the world right now feels devastatingly broken. Quakers have, I think, at our best, always had a creative response to violence and pain and brokenness and oppression. And I think that the long history of Quaker service is one of our most compelling and important gifts to the world, and one of the ways that we have always responded to and witnessed to pain and suffering and brokenness in the world. So I want to tell you both about Quaker Voluntary Service and the history of Quaker service, but also I thought maybe I would focus a bit on my story of the leading to begin QVS and what that was like, and some of what I've learned along the way, because I think one of the most important parts of the Quaker tradition is that we are all, not only do we all have access, direct and immediate access to God or the divine or spirit, but that we can all be guided by that relationship and that spirit, and that part of what we do together is corporately listen and discern how we are being led both individually and as a community. And so I think the story of QVS and my part of that story is a story of discernment and listening and action, for me individually, but for our whole community. And I also want to do a little bit of situating that story, especially for our fellows, in the longer tradition and history and context of Quaker service, not only so that you have a little bit of an understanding about the stream that you're stepping into, but also because you are now part of changing and shaping that stream. So, as you all already know, I'm the Executive Director of Quaker Voluntary Service, and I just really briefly, for folks who are here who might not know what Quaker Voluntary Service is, I'm just going to give a really brief description of how our program works, and for the fellows, you can make sure that this is what you thought you were signing up for, and I didn't miss anything important. In QVS, young adults, and these are the folks here who are starting their year of service, live together in intentional community. We currently are in 4 cities. So would the Atlanta house raise your hands? Atlanta, all right. Philadelphia, woohoo. Portland, Oregon, and Boston. All right. And next year we will be opening a house in Minneapolis, St. Paul. So that will be our 5th house of service. Yeah. So these amazing folks will live together in one of those 4 cities communally in a house. They will share daily living, a small stipend. They'll figure out how to cook and grocery shop and make decisions using Quaker process. They'll worship together as a house. They'll worship in relationship with local friends, meetings, and churches. And they will all be doing their service full-time in local organizations in our cities that we partner with. So we're not inventing service projects for them. We're partnering with organizations that have been in our communities for a long time and will be there for a long time, whether we're there or not. But our fellows, the way we understand it is that our fellows are there to increase the capacity of those organizations to do work that they might not otherwise be able to do if they didn't have this full-time person for the year. So that's what they're doing for their service. But then there's also a whole layer of experience of training and leadership development and spiritual formation. They are each paired with a spiritual nurturer. Some folks in this room have been spiritual nurturers for us in the Philadelphia program. So it's a very all-encompassing experience. Does everyone still want to stay? Okay, good. We are, as I said, this is our 6th year. We're beginning our 6th year, so we're still quite new. And so a lot of who we are and what we're doing has been changing and growing and refining over the past 5 years. So I want to go back now and tell you some of the story of how this came to be and some of the lessons that I've learned. So the first lesson, I guess, is about discernment and how, at least in my experience, looking back over the past 10 years or so, it kind of looks like everything I was doing was leading up to starting QVS, and it all made sense and it all fit together, but that is not how it felt at the time. And so I think sometimes it's important to know that, you have to discern what the next right step is, and maybe it all fits together and you're headed somewhere, or maybe you're just taking those right steps. But that discernment can happen in lots of different ways. And I don't believe that there is one right path, but there are many right paths if we are paying attention. And also that leadings can take a long time, at least in my experience, to form and come to fruition. The title of my talk, which is also the title of Sarah's latest poetry book, wherever Sarah is, our Portland coordinator, Coming Alive, is for me, it's from a Howard Thurman quote. And Thurman was a 20th century theologian and civil rights activist and one of my heroes. Not that I ever met him, but someone who I love. And he was actually a student of Rufus Jones, who was a Quaker theologian. So there's a long tradition there. But Thurman said, don't ask what the world needs. Ask what makes you come alive, and then go and do that. because what the world needs is people who have come alive. And I don't think that he meant, just do what makes you happy or like what feels good. I think that deeper sense of coming alive, I think, is about how we listen to our inner guide, our inner teacher, how we discern communally what we're being called to do. And so for me, one of the ways that I know whether I'm kind of on the right path is whether there's a sense of aliveness and rightness. And that doesn't mean that it's easy or always fun, but that there's that sense of coming alive that Thurman talks about. So for me, the leading to start QVS and the work that it took and what we're doing now has always had that sense of aliveness and rightness. And it didn't necessarily feel like it was all making sense for a long time, but looking back, it does. I grew up in Charlotte, North Carolina, in the Charlotte Friends Meeting, which is a kind of, for the South, kind of a large unprogrammed meeting, similar to Atlanta meeting where I'm a member now. And when I was growing up, I think this has changed a lot. I'm 37, so when I was growing up, our first day school, so the education that the kids received in the meeting, we learned a lot about peace and justice and community and some of the really amazing, important values of Friends. We learned about Quaker history and we learned about other faith traditions, but we didn't really learn much about the spiritual and religious grounding of Quakerism. Some of you have heard me tell this story a million times, but I'll tell it again, that when I was growing up, the one time I remember studying the Bible was in first day school, was before we went to see Jesus Christ Superstar, the musical, so that we would know what it was about. And so we listened, I remember listening on a little tape recorder, we listened to the soundtrack, and then we would like flip and try to find the Bible story that corresponded with that song. So that was my introduction to the Bible. I mean, it was pretty fun, way to get introduced. And so one gift of that is that I didn't really have much baggage about scripture or that I had to kind of get rid of when I got into it more later in life. But I realized as a young adult that I felt a little bit cheated by that, that I was very grateful for many of the things that I had learned growing up in the Quaker meeting, but I felt like there was some big thing lacking there about the religious tradition and the spiritual grounding of our faith. So when I went to Guilford, I actually became a religious studies major, but it wasn't, at that point, it wasn't really because I was that interested in religion, or so I thought, but because at that time at Guilford, the religious studies major was kind of the social justice major. And so I was taking classes like feminist theology and liberation theology and theology in the civil rights movement. And so through that learning was when I was like, oh, well, why didn't we learn any of this stuff? I mean, we could have learned the good, radical, exciting parts of our tradition. I think that, I understand now that the adults in my meeting didn't want to impose things on us that they had found harmful in their own upbringing. So it came from a good intention, but I think what it meant was that we didn't really learn anything in terms of religious formation and spiritual formation. So after Guilford, so I became really interested in theology and interested in religion, and because, like I said, I didn't really have any negative baggage, so that was the good part of it. So when I came to it, it was like all this very exciting, liberation-focused religious studies work, and so that was very exciting to me, but I felt like I had really missed something deeper in my Quaker upbringing. After I graduated from Guilford, I was like really excited about being in the world and doing social justice work and being a Quaker, and I found it like very difficult to find anything that I could do because I didn't have much work experience, I didn't really have a resume, I was just out of college, and there wasn't anything like QVS at the time, and I heard about some other faith-based programs and other service programs that existed, but there wasn't anything specifically for Quakers at that point. So, not that I knew about. I moved to Philadelphia, not because of Quakers, and I kind of for a little while was like, I don't think I even want to be a Quaker anymore because Quakers aren't radical enough, and Quakers aren't even really faith-based enough, and I want to be hanging out with these other really radical Christians. So I lived in a Catholic worker house in Germantown for a while, and just found a lot of connection and inspiration and depth from people who were really rooted in their faith tradition and were doing really incredible, powerful work for social justice. And to me, it seemed like they were able to do that work in such a powerful way that was still so full of hope and joy. And my perception was that that was because they were so rooted in their faith tradition. And for me at that time, that was not something I was experiencing much from Quakers. So I was really wrestling with, what's going on with our Quaker community, and of course, knowing all of these stories of Quaker history, feeling like we used to be more prophetic and we used to be more bold and we used to be doing all these things, and what are we doing now, and what is our witness now? And some of it was like I just didn't actually know all the things that were happening, but some of it I think was really that there was something missing about our witness and our power. So I had heard all these stories growing up about Quaker service and about American Friends Service Committee work camps and Philadelphia Yearly Meeting work camps. And those experiences, when I heard these stories from elders, seemed like they were the experiences that really set folks on a path for the rest of their lives. So they were sometimes the reason that people became Quakers was because they participated in these service projects, or it was the reason they stayed Quaker, or it was where they figured out what they wanted to do with their lives vocationally. And in lots of cases, it was where people met their spouses. So they were these like very formative and transformative experiences for so many people. But by the time I was a young adult, those opportunities didn't exist anymore. And I can tell you more about why that is later. But I began to wonder about, okay, so I'm feeling like there's this lack in our prophetic witness and in our boldness and in our witness in the world. And I'm wondering what's happening to all the young adults that I grew up with in the Quaker community, because people just weren't really sticking around. There wasn't really a lot holding us. And I sort of came to think that if all that's holding us to this community is liberal values and, peace and justice values, that's all good, but we can find that in lots of other places. There are a lot of organizations with really good values in the world, and so if that's what liberal Quakerism has to offer, why would we stick around? There's lots of other places we can get that. So I was having all these questions. So I had what I think of as sort of these dual concerns, and one piece of the concern was what's happening to young adults and young people that were part of my wing of the Quaker tradition, and the other concern was, why are Quakers not being as bold and prophetic as we used to be, and as I perceived that these other faith groups were being. And I mean, part of this was just like where I was at in my life as a 22-year-old as well. But I was living here in Philadelphia, and at one point I was living with some Mennonite friends, and I heard from them about Mennonite voluntary service, and I didn't know anything about it before that. And they talked about this like, it sounded familiar in terms of what I'd heard about the work camps, in that it was an experience that everybody in the Mennonite community knew about. Many, many people did it. Most people did it when they were young adults, and it shaped and formed them in really profound ways into what they did for the rest of their lives, and they felt really well supported by their faith community in doing it. It was something people could do right out of college, or if they hadn't gone to college, and have a way to be engaged in the world and be supported by their faith community. So all these pieces were kind of, in my mind, and I just at some point said, well, we need a program like that for Quakers. We need something to fill the space that the work camps used to fill. And I began to understand more about why the work camps didn't exist in the way that they had previously, but nothing had come up to fill that space. So I had this big idea, and I was like, Quakers need a program like Mennonite Voluntary Service. That was like in 2003. And so the next lesson is about timing, and you can have a great idea, but it might not be the right time for the idea. So I thought it was the right time. I was really excited about this idea, but I didn't really know anything, and I didn't really know anybody, and I had like no experience. But I would just start talking about this to anyone who would listen to me, like, I have this idea, we need to do this. And I remember I even like submitted a proposal to Philadelphia Yearly Meeting for how they should they had this old work camp house in West Philadelphia that they were trying to decide what to do with in like 2003 or 2004. And I wrote this proposal, and I was like, this is the greatest idea. This is what we should do. And they were like, what are you talking about? Who are you? And like, that was the end of that. But I wasn't deterred. I still thought it was a good idea, even though other people didn't think so. And so I just the concern didn't go away, right? So the core of the concern was about how do we support young adults and how do we re-enliven our prophetic tradition. So I found other ways to address that concern. I mean, I think that is part of the story of a leading and of a concern, and how we discern our action in the world is that there's not necessarily one right way to respond to a concern or to live something that you feel called to do. So I did some other things. I became, again, more committed to and involved with Quakers, even though I was still enamored of these other radical Christian groups. But I decided, no, I'm a Quaker. I'm committed to this. I'm going to stick with this community. So I became involved. Well, I started working for American Friends Service Committee with Oscar, and I became involved in Friends General Conference at that time. Had just started this new youth ministries committee that I became part of, and so that work addressed one of my concerns, which was about how we support young adults. And my work at AFSC was kind of addressing some of my other concerns about, how do we be these prophetic witnesses in the world. But I still wanted all those things to happen together. Like I felt like I was compartmentalizing. I was like an activist over here with AFSC, and then I had my spiritual life over here, and I was trying to figure out how to be a young adult and figure out who I was, but like it wasn't all coming together in the way that I was wanting it to. But looking back, I think all of those things, again, in retrospect, I can understand how all those things were very important to my journey and to the what became QVS, even though it didn't necessarily feel like it at the time. Another really, really important part of this journey for me, and I think I would say for anyone who is discerning any kind of leading in the world, is to find people who will support you and to find good mentors. And for whatever reason, I've always been the kind of person that isn't afraid to ask for help or ask people who I think are really interesting if they'll sit down and talk to me and have coffee with me. So I would encourage all of you to make that a practice. I always say that to QVS fellows, like, if you think someone is interesting, go and talk to them, because it would be very hard for me to imagine anyone saying, no, I don't want to have coffee with you, young adult person. Like, most people will be really excited to support you and have that conversation and see how they can be in your life and support you. So that's encouragement to you. And it's also encouragement to any of us who notice someone who might need some encouragement or has a gift, for you to name that gift in them, because we need to name gifts for each other. So that's part of my story with QVS is that by this point I was living in Atlanta in 2008, working for AFSC. And when you all were doing the skit about the meaningful work that was like 1 million hours a week, that was my job at AFSC. Oscar, understands. We were doing this together. It was really good work. It was like my dream job. If I could have, when I was graduating from Guilford, if I thought I could work for AFSC doing peace work, that was like my dream job. I had my dream job, but I was totally burned out. I was exhausted. It was not coming from any kind of spiritually grounded place whatsoever for me personally. And I had decided I was going to quit my job and go to seminary, which most Quakers were like, why would you do that? And I didn't even really know why I wanted to do it, except that I knew that so many of the people who I felt like were able to be engaged in social justice work and not get burnt out were people who had some kind of deep faith orientation, whatever it was. And so I was like, I need some of that, because I can't do this. I'm only like I was like 28. I'm only 28 and I'm like burning out. This is not going to work. I need to figure out how to have a more sustainable life. So I had decided I was going to go to seminary and quit my job at AFSC. And I was at a committee meeting for FGC, French General Conference, and Bruce Burchard, who was at the time the general secretary of FGC, which for those of you that aren't Quakers, like the executive director, basically. And he is someone who I had gotten to know through this youth work that I had been doing to support young adults. So we were taking a walk, and he was one of the people that was like, why are you going to seminary? What are you going to do with this? And I said, well, actually, Bruce, what I really want to do is keep working on this idea about starting a service program for young adult Quakers. And I will never forget this moment, because it was one of these just like, one of these moments. We stopped on our walk, and he put his hand on my shoulder, and he looked at me really intently, and he said, okay, I think we're ready. You're the person to do it, and I will help you. I was like, me? You sure? But that moment was like really, really big for me, because here was this person who was a mentor and a friend and someone who I looked up to and who had like social capital and power and all this stuff. And he was saying, yes, do this, you can do it, and I will help you. And I think not only was it so important that he was naming, you have the capability to do this, I see that you're capable of this, but also I will help you. That was really key, because he did help me. He helped. We would not be sitting in this room today if Bruce Burchard had not helped me. He opened doors to wealthy Quakers that I never would have been able to meet on my own, who gave donations to help get QVS off the ground. He used all of his, 30 years of experience in the Quaker world and organizations to advise us on how to start this organization and what the next steps were. He takes Philadelphia Fellows on canoe trips. He's like every level of QVS he has poured himself into. But at that moment, knowing that he thought I could do it and that he was going to help me, it was like, okay, I think I can probably do that then. So that was in 2008, and then in 2009, he and others, we organized a consultation, so a gathering of, there were about 40 people that came, and it was here at Pendle Hill, and actually we met at Brinton House. That was the last time I was in Brinton House before this orientation, was for this 2009 consultation, and we called it like the Consultation on Quaker Service or something like that. And the point of this consultation was to get a bunch of other people in the room who had some connection to the ideas we were talking about, to say, is this a good idea? And if so, what should it look like? And who should be involved? And how are we going to do it? And as it turned out, this wasn't just my good idea, of course. Like, there were lots of people all over the place who had had a similar idea, or unbeknownst to me, because I didn't really know anything at that point, but I learned there were other efforts similar to this that had been tried and had succeeded and had been laid down, and different things over the course of the past 20 years or so. So there were a lot of people around the country with not only interest, but expertise and experience. And, folks came from Guilford and Earlham and Pendle Hill and all these different places to talk about what could this look like, and what would be the purpose, and what are the core values that we want to be doing here. And so we left that consultation in 2009 with the clarity that, yes, something like this should exist. And I was still able to be in a position to say yes to being the person bringing it forward. So another lesson is, don't let lack of experience keep you from doing something that you dream of. Because if I had known all the things I was going to have to learn how to do, I promise you I would never have done this. I just had this leading and this vision, and I knew what I wanted to see, but I didn't know how to write a 501c3 application, but I learned. I did it. I didn't know how to ask for money, but I learned, and Bruce helped me and other people helped me. I didn't know how to find a house for people to live in. There were a lot of things I didn't know how to do, but I asked for lots of help, and and all these things happened, and it came together. So Ross referred to this earlier in his presentation about community, but one of our first donors to QVS said that his piece of advice was to fail early and often. And we did. I don't think we had major failures, but we learned a lot. We made lots of mistakes, and we learned from those mistakes. And I think that, I think one of the reasons why this, even though there were lots of people who had had a vision like this before and some things had been tried, I think one of the reasons that it hadn't come to fruition before was just wanting it to be perfect before something was started. And me and the folks who were part of the original board of QVS just kind of said, like, let's just try it. We're never gonna figure this out until we just get our hands dirty and try it. And so we started the first program in 2012, and Liz was one of the people that was courageous enough and adventurous enough to come to Atlanta and try this thing that was totally untested. We made some mistakes, but it worked. And we then started the house in Philadelphia with Ross here in 2013, and in Portland in 2013, and then Boston in 2015, and Minneapolis next year. Another really important lesson in all of this for me was to know your history, to know your tradition. Someone, I don't know who said this, I wish I could give them credit. I say this phrase all the time, I don't know who I stole it from, but someone said that you have to be really rooted in your tradition so that you can innovate with integrity. So in other words, like, if you don't know where you're coming from and you don't deeply know your history and your tradition, you can't critique it and change it and innovate with it as authentically. So one of the things that, I had heard about work camps, and I had heard about Quaker service projects and all that kind of stuff, but I was able to, in seminary the year before we actually launched the Atlanta house, I was able to do a lot of research and wrote my thesis on the history of Quaker service, and really spent lots of time in the AFSC archives and interviewing people and really trying to understand what were these experiences and why were they so transformative, what happened, who was part of them, and why did they end, and what were the lessons learned, so that people would say to me, like, do you know why the work camps ended, and are you going to make those same mistakes? I don't know. I will try to not make those mistakes. So really, trying to understand that history, because it is so much a part of who we are. And what we're doing is very, very different than what the work camps did. It's a very different model. But I hope we're having some of the same kind of effect in terms of the people who are participating in these programs. I have a couple of slides. This is really, I don't have a PowerPoint presentation like anything, but I thought it might be fun for you to just see a couple of slides of some of those old work camps, just so you get like a little taste of that history. And there are people in this room who might be able to share with you more in Q&A time about their experience, Howard and Paula Sell in particular, of some of this. And if the technology doesn't work, it's not that important, but. Yeah, so there's Panasonic. That's great. Okay, that's okay. Yeah, that's okay. We don't. Oh, okay. So this was the first. These are two pictures from the first work camp, from the first AFSC work camp in 1934. At that time, the work camps were mostly summer projects. So folks committed for a summer, and much of the work was physical, like hard physical labor. So that's not what you guys are doing mostly. But that was what some of that was. You can skip to the next slide. One thing that I think is really, so these are just like some images from the earliest of the AFSC work camps. These went on for decades. 1934, you can skip to the next one. This was in Philadelphia in 1936. You can skip that because you can't read that anyway. This was an international work camp in Finland. There you are. So AFSC developed both domestic and international work camps, and some of them were summer, but some of them were longer. They became, year-long in other at past QVS orientations, we've had an amazing woman. If you can skip to the next one, I think she's in this. Yeah. This is Pat Hunt in this picture, who is still alive. She's 95, I believe, and she lives at Pendle, not too far from here. And she's been with us for orientation for the past 3 years, and I'm sad that she wasn't able to be here this year. But Pat, this is just like one of the work camps that Pat participated in and led. She was part of decades of AFSC work. And I actually want to read you a quote from Pat, because Pat has been, one of the most amazing parts of this work for me has been to get to know people like Pat and Howard and Paula, and just the stories that we have in our community are so vast and amazing. And Pat is just one of the smartest people I have ever met. And it's amazing how I'll tell her about some challenge we're having in QVS, and she'll say, oh yeah, well, we dealt with that kind of thing in 1940 with this or that. And it's like, but it's some of the same things. So she wrote to me once about QVS and her experience, and this is her, Pat. She said, the more I learn about QVS, the more I appreciate its mission of spirit-led social change and transforming service. Though these words were not used 70 years ago when I first participated in Quaker service projects, these experiences shaped my life. I grew to understand the essential bond between faith and action. QVS is carrying on this task of building leadership that is appropriate for this generation. So I'm sorry you didn't get to meet Pat this year, but if you're in Philadelphia, you might get to meet her. She's amazing. I think there's maybe one more picture. That's her again. That's it. You can turn it off. I also, maybe afterwards, if anyone's interested, I'm kind of a Quaker history geek, so I think these are really cool. But these are like actual like recruitment pamphlets for work camps. So this one's from 1937. I think it's really funny because a lot of them are like men with their shirts off. So I don't know if we should be doing that for QVS recruitment, but anyway, this is a 1937 recruitment flyer. So anyway, take a look. These are really interesting. There's one from 1942. There's a bunch here. And this is, so what we're doing is very different, right? Mostly. You don't have to wear shirts, but mostly we're not doing, physical labor projects. But this is a tradition that I see us as being part of this stream. And we've learned a lot since 1937 and 1940 about service. And one of the reasons, I don't really have time to get into it all here, but we can talk more about it later. One of the reasons that the work camps ended is because of a critique of the way the service was being done, of a critique that it was being done in a more paternalistic way, and that it wasn't engaging appropriately with communities. And so, and that all happened in the 60s, and there's a huge shift in culture and understanding about everything in the 60s. And the last, by 1980, there really weren't any more AFSC work camps. There was like 1 or 2 left, but there weren't many. So I don't mean to romanticize the work camps and to say that the way that all of that was happening was perfect, because it certainly wasn't, and there were a lot of mistakes made. But I do think that for 1937 and 1940, some of the ways that they were doing this was pretty radical and pretty transformative. And so I hope we can learn from those experiences and take the best of that forward. But of course, the way we're doing things is very different now, and I'm thankful for all the lessons that have been learned that we can benefit from. Okay. Another important lesson, and some of this has to do with the work camps, but more than the work camps, it has to do with learning from other programs. So not reinventing the wheel when we didn't need to. There are about 15 year-long faith-based voluntary service programs, and pretty much everybody operates on the same model of working in nonprofit agencies, living together communally, and having some kind of spiritual formation and leadership development programming. So we basically just copied the model that everyone else was using. But then we got to say, well, what makes this uniquely Quaker? And because we're a new organization, we don't have to deal with that's the way we've always done things, so how do we change? We got to, invent our culture from the ground up. And so what kind of organization do we want to be? How do we want to communicate? How do we want to operate? How are we working to be anti-racist? All of these things that older organizations that have been around for a while have to struggle with changing. When we didn't have to change, we're like building it, and you guys are helping us build it. So that's an interesting part about QVS. But we spent a lot of time in the beginning learning from particularly Jesuit Volunteer Corps, Lutheran Volunteer Corps, and Mennonite Voluntary Service about their models, and they were so generous to us. They shared program plans and budgets, and I had someone from JVC on speed dial for a while, like, oh my God, this just happened, what do we do? And she would say, oh, we've been dealing with that for 50 years, don't worry about it. And one of the things that I heard from those other groups initially was, well, we modeled our service programs on Quaker service in the first place. And where have you guys been for the past 30 years? So yes, again, we copied their most recent models, but we've all been in this work for a long time together. And I also think it's been really exciting for me and for others part of QVS that now that we're back at that table of ecumenical service programs, we're getting to share with them from Quaker practice. So like we're teaching them things. And so we built in the spiritual nurture component from the beginning of QVS. And now other programs are starting to do that too, because they've seen the value of that from QVS. And, I've gotten to lead workshops on clearness committees for young adults from other programs. And so sharing our practices with a wider community is also really important. And I continually hear things like, oh, well, we've heard of Quakers and we think Quakers are cool, but we've never met one. So just being more visible and more at the table is one of the things that we're able to do in QVS. Okay, so I'm almost done. I know this has been long. That was a lot of looking back, and I just want to do a little bit of where we are now and looking forward. And I think I've talked a lot about the things I learned in starting QVS, so earlier, 10 years ago, 5 years ago. But I want to talk a little bit about some of the things I've learned from leading QVS for the past 5 years, and there's so many things. So this is just like a couple of them. One thing I've learned is to be really clear about who you are and who you're not, and really clear about your mission. It probably won't surprise some of you to know that we are constantly receiving like, oh, QVS should do this. QVS should start programs for retired people. QVS should start this kind of program or that kind of program. And there's a lot of excitement and energy about what we're doing. But so far, we've been really clear that like, that's a great idea, but our mission is working with young adults. And this is who we are, and this is what we're doing. And I think that's one of the reasons that we've been able to be successful, is to not kind of get distracted by lots of great ideas, which I hope someone does, but to say that, this is who we are and this is what we're doing. And that includes, like there have been times where a grant might have been available if we had sort of shifted what we were doing and made it a little different, and, really trying to just stay as clear about our mission and who we are as possible, even if that means letting go of money or whatever. And along with that is, because we're a new organization, I think we're able to be very flexible, and nimble is like this new in word, I guess, but we're able to be nimble. We can respond to things very quickly. Our staff is small. We have really close relationships. We know each other well. We can respond to things as they come up, and we're not kind of mired in, well, that sounds really negative, but we're not encumbered by layers and layers of Quaker process and committees and structure that slows down decision making and means that you can never make a statement about anything or whatever. We can just do what we feel led to do, and we do it. One time someone from some other Quaker organization was like, oh wow, who does your social media? And I was like, well, Liz, we do it, and who picks your quotes? Sarah. I mean, we do it ourselves. And they were like, you mean you don't have to get all those approved by a committee first? You just post things on Facebook? I'm like, yeah. So I don't know. I mean, some of it's just like, we just do it. We don't ask for permission. We just do it. Along those lines, truly, I think I've said this to a couple of you, and as we've taken walks and talked about things, but for me, what I've learned is the core of QVS, of course, our mission and working with young adults and service and all of that, but is about relationships. And I hope that all of you fellows will experience the power of supportive relationships within your house community, from your staff, from your Quaker meeting partners, from your spiritual nurturers, from your site placements. Sometimes you might feel like you're being too well supported. But I think, yeah, that's real. But I think that is the core of who QVS is that we're about relationships and we're about people, and we do have more now than we did 3 years ago. We do have policies and we do have procedures and, things that you have to have as a well-functioning organization, but not to the extent that we can't be flexible and responsive when a need arises or when a fellow is in a particular circumstance that requires our attention in a certain way. And that's who we are, and I hope that's who we will always be. We are expanding again to Minneapolis. We might expand after that, I don't know. But for me, at least anyway, I don't want us to ever get so big that we lose that personal, relationship-based way of doing things, because if we lose that, then I think we lose what is really essential to who we are and our way of working. And that also means that you all in this room are going to be part of shaping what this organization is and how we do things for the rest of our existence, because we're able to be in close relationship with each of you and because we care about you and we care about your success and who you want to be in the world. And so I said this to some of you earlier, but really, we really take seriously your feedback and your suggestions for how we can be better and be different. And so I hope that you will enter into that partnership with us this year and beyond as alumni. We now have 100 alumni, 100 people who have gone through QVS. I remember when that was like, we wrote in a grant proposal. I think you helped me write this when Howard, a grant proposal of like, in 5 years, we will have, touched the lives of 100 people. And I remember writing that like, wow, that seems like forever from now. Is that really going to ever happen? But here we are, and it has happened. And now we have another 30 amazing, talented young people who are going to give a year of your lives to this work. And I hope that you have some of the experience that I had in starting QVS in terms of having your gifts named and in feeling supported and in feeling challenged and feeling held and feeling like someone is in your corner and is there to say, you have a good idea and you are the one to do it and I will help you. I promise I will be that person for you. I will help you if you have a leading that you want to explore. And I know that that's true for most of all of the people in the QVS community who are supporting you, whether that's staff or local support committee members or your spiritual nurturers, that's why we're here. You all have amazing gifts to bring to the world, to Quakers, but certainly to the world beyond Quakers. So thank you for trusting us with a year of your life, and thank you for stepping into this long tradition and history and for helping us shape it for the future. And for helping us to understand who we all are collectively and how we can be transformative agents in the world. Thank you.
Thank you so very much. It's our custom to take a few moments for questions or comments. If you have one, I would ask if you would raise your hand, and Christine will call on you, and I will bring the microphone by, and if you hold the microphone just the way I am right below my lower lip, then people who are listening to the video or watching the video later on will be able to hear your question as well as Christina's response. All right, I'll start with one question just to get things off and rolling. When you talked about the work camps being more physical labor and the model as being somewhat paternalistic, could you give us a little bit more information about what the work camps consisted of, and how that model was later perceived as being paternalistic. And now we're not doing physical labor. What does that suggest?
Yeah. Well, there's others in this room who could probably answer that more, and I might invite Howard or Paula to respond if you want to. I keep referring to Howard and Paula, who are members of our local support committee in Philadelphia and who participated in various work camps, and they met in an AFSC work camp. So,
Would you like to respond?
yeah, I would love for you to respond if you would be willing. Thank you.
So Paula and I led 3 projects during the 1960s, one with high school students, 2 with college students. The high school project did not fit into that category. It was very deconstructive. And by that I mean we literally deconstructed an old hunting camp in California and restored it to wilderness. And what was really interesting about that project in one sense is that it included both hearing and deaf high school students. So they were learning to communicate around that work. The other 2 projects in Detroit and in Compton, California, well, it was in Royal Oak Township, which is just outside Detroit. Those were, as the critique of the 60s put it, they were drop-in projects. They were of real value to the participants, but the participants in their critique, as well as those who shared in that critique later, all wondered about the lasting value of what they were doing. I also, Christina, you and I are going to have a conversation because I was on the committee that rejected your proposal.
Now you tell me.
Full confession here. I didn't remember that. Anyway,
Oh, well.
so I was very involved with the weekend work camp program here in Philadelphia that Dave Ritchie launched in the 1930s that went on and on and on. There were other people leading it. Again, that was a drop-in project. It was a weekend that had a powerful impact on the high school participants, mostly high school. Its value for the community, not so much. And so that was, that would be my response, that out of that experience, I think it was appropriate for the service committee and for Philadelphia Yearly Meeting to take another look and find alternative ways to do youth work.
I see a hand over here. Did you see another one, Christina?
First of all, thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. My name's Roger Cassidy. I'm the clerk of Quaker Service Norway and just visiting family here in Pennsylvania right now and had the opportunity to be here this evening, so I'm very grateful for that. I want to make 2 comments, basically. One is the importance of planting seeds. Quaker Service Norway's founder, our grandfather, is a gentleman by the name of Egil Magne Hovdenuk, who some of you may have heard of. He's written a book about his experience. He was in Finland in 1947. He went to that camp, and that's where he first met Quakers. He was a young pacifist who was a conscientious objector and had just experienced the occupation of Norway during the Second World War. I think he was 15, 16 years old when the war was over, and his family had been bombed. They'd been internal refugees. That was 47. In 52, he went to Algeria and worked with the Bedouin community there, or the Berber community there. That became a project that lasted for 7 years. From 1963 and until 1963, when Quaker Service Norway was founded. and became the first organization that got funding from the Norwegian government as a faith-based organization to work in peace and development projects. So 47, 52, and 63 it took before the organization that I'm now asked to help lead got on its feet. So things happen exactly because of these meetings and people getting together. And that probably has no notion that people who in Finland know that that's where Norway Quaker Service got its modern start. That was the first comment. And the second one was, we are part of or parallel to Norway Yearly Meeting. And the comment about being able to turn around very quickly and actually take a stand on petitions or social actions or mobilizations and things like this. We have a 9-member board, and literally in 24 hours we can say we're on, and the Quakers are sort of covered because the Norway Yearly Meeting has a process, a very good Quaker process, but it takes a week at best if everyone's available and checking their emails, types of things. So there's something wonderful about good ideas leading to action without too much bureaucracy. So I recognize that, I praise that, we experience that, and we're very happy that the way we're set up, we're able to do that. And I think everyone sleeps a little bit better at night because they know we will be present where we're called to be present. So I see a very strong parallel there, and continued good luck with your work. Thank you for sending Lara Wick to us,
Yeah.
one of your alumni. She's a very big service to us at Oslo Monthly Meeting in Quaker Service Norway. Thank you.
Oh, okay.
So what kind of projects do you do and how do you select them?
Well, if we had time, I would have all of our fellows tell you all the places that they're going to be working. But we work with a whole variety of organizations in each of our cities. We select them. We have a whole process of criteria for what we're looking for. We call them site placement organizations, so the sites where our fellows are going to be working. So some examples in Atlanta, we have a fellow at the Southern Center for Human Rights. Is that Alicia? Yeah, you're going to be there. We have someone at Habitat for Humanity. We have someone at the Sierra Club. We have, what else we have in Atlanta? 9 to 5 Working Women. So organizations that represent a broad diversity of issues, so environmental issues, poverty, homelessness, immigration, all kinds of issues. Part of what we're looking for, ideally, is that in each of our cities, our fellows are in different kinds of issue-based organizations so that they are able to learn from each other about other things that are happening in the city, what other issues are going on with their housemates. We select organizations sometimes just based on who we have relationships with in the cities where we work, especially when we're starting a city. It's the hardest when we don't have a track record yet, so it's a lot of personal relationships with what Quakers in Minneapolis have relationships with social justice organizations in the city that can help us make those relationships. Now, because we've been around for a while, in many of our cities, we have a good reputation, and so organizations are coming to us and wanting to partner with us. Certainly in Philadelphia, we have more organizations that want a QVS fellow from year to year than we can even accommodate because we don't have enough people. So yeah, we look for organizations that are engaged in their communities. We look at who the supervisor of our fellows is going to be. We look at the reputation that the organization has amongst other social justice organizers in the community. Yeah, anything that other staff would add about how we select organizations?
Under an hour commute from the QVS house.
Yeah. Yes.
Under an hour commute from the QVS house in the city.
Mostly under a half hour.
And right now, the way, I haven't said anything about the way our financial model works, but they also have to be organizations that have enough resources to pay to have a fellow. So that's part of why we used to call them volunteers. We now call them fellows. And part of that is because they really aren't volunteers in the sense that you typically think of as a volunteer. They're actually being compensated, not enormously, but, you know, having a place to live and having a stipend and having health insurance if they need it and having all the support from staff. So organizations pay around $16,000 a year for that fellow service to QVS so that we can provide all of that to them. So it has to be an organization that has some kind of resources. We've had organizations in the past that we'd love to work with who can't afford that fee. So, you know, there's a kind of a sweet spot of what kind of organization we can work with.
I got to be a part of the American Friends Service Committee summer workshop back in the years of 1949 and 1950 when I was a college student. It was called Institutional Service Units, and we worked in mental hospitals. And it was just, those 2 summers were incredibly important to my life formation because it was from working in those 2 mental hospitals that I decided I wanted to go into nursing. And it was going into nursing that brought me to Philadelphia from the Midwest. And I met a whole bunch of different kinds of Quakers than I'd grown up with. And it was just an amazingly transformative experience, particularly the first summer. The first summer was in Wilmer, Minnesota, and they had a brand new governor that year, Governor Youngdahl, who had this $6 million mental health program. And back in 1949, that was a lot of money. And up until then, the mental hospital that we were in at Wilmar, that was kind of the dumping ground for all the state hospitals in the state. And there were people there, most of the people there had been there for 20 or 30 years, and lots of people who hadn't spoken for many years and so on. They still were using the camisoles, the straitjackets. They were still doing, and there was a surgeon who came down every Thursday afternoon from the Twin Cities and did lobotomies on 4 people. But the new program was called the Total Push Recreation Program, so that the idea was that every patient in that hospital was supposed to have some kind of recreational opportunities, and that's what we were doing. There were 19 of us in our group, and so we would take these people they would do music, band with the sticks and the tambourines and all that kind of thing. We would take some people on hikes. Everybody got up and out. They stopped using straitjackets that year. And so it was really an amazing kind of transformative time, not only for us, but for the patients too. They got a lot of new experiences. And we learned a whole lot about what kinds of opportunities and importance there was in working in mental health. And I wasn't the only one who decided what career I was going to take in that group. Many of us were influenced by that. So it was a wonderful, very powerful experience. And we didn't have that back in the 40s, 48 and 49, we didn't have some of the problems that the 60s workshops had, because sex, drugs, and rock and roll was not really happening so much back then. So that the workshop experience, or the work camp experience, was a very wonderful thing for us. So I'm very grateful for that experience, and I'm very grateful that that time was a reference point for you, Christine, for you looking back and saying, hey, we used to do that for our Quaker young people. What can we do now? So I'm thrilled. And I did get to be a spiritual nurture person for a couple years ago, the Philadelphia program, and that was such a rich experience for me. And my nurturee, I graduated from Earlham School of Religion several years ago, and she's now at Earlham School of Religion, and I believe that I maybe had a small part in that. So this is such an amazing program, and I remember hearing you talk about it many years ago when it was still forming, and it was becoming a possibility, and how thrilled I was about it then. So this is amazing to me to hear where you've come. So I'm so happy.
Thanks.
Thank you, Mickey.
You talked about the importance of being rooted in a tradition in order to innovate with integrity or criticize with integrity. And I'm curious, as someone myself who came to Quakerism through action later in life and wasn't actually raised in a Quaker tradition, I didn't know Quakers existed until college. I'm curious about the ways for fellows who that is also true. Quaker practice and tradition is not something they perhaps are strongly rooted in, and in fact might be introduced to. How do you try to bring in a sense of rooting, and how do you receive feedback, knowing that many of these traditions are new?
That's a good question. Ooh, I feel like lots of people in this room would have good answers to that question. I think in my experience, it's usually about roughly half of our fellows come in identifying as Quaker and roughly half don't. And sometimes that's not quite the percentage, but it's something like that usually. So there's a lot of folks who do QVS who do not identify as Quaker coming in or going out necessarily, but many people have had some kind of, whether you went to a Quaker college or you knew a Quaker or something, there's some kind of experience, and then for some people, none at all. This morning, I was really struck by how many of you were saying that this morning worship at Pendle Hill was their first Quaker meeting for worship. So other staff might have different perspectives on this, but I think in my experience, the folks who are coming into QVS who don't come from a Quaker background are very open to and interested in learning Quaker practices and are really excited, or I don't know if excited might be the right word, but like committed to going to meeting. And I think for folks who grew up Quaker, it's a different kind of experience because there's a whole lot of expectations about what is a Quaker? What does it mean to be Quaker? What is a really Quaker space? And so I think what often happens is within house communities, there's the relationships that are developed amongst fellows who maybe are Quaker or aren't Quaker. That's where so much of the learning, I think, happens for people about what does it mean to you to be a Quaker? If you were raised Quaker, what does that mean to you? What practices are important to you? And if you're new to Quakerism, what practices are resonating with you from this experience and what is not making sense? I remember one year in Atlanta, one of the people who was in the house who wasn't Quaker at one point said, I feel like I'm asking all these stupid questions because I don't know all this terminology, but what we realized in that context was that actually that was so good for everyone, because you can grow up in a tradition and not really know anything about your tradition, or you can grow up in a tradition and think you know what a clearness committee is or something like that, and you have no idea because you haven't, I mean, I didn't, like I said in my talk, I didn't have any like real religious formation or spiritual formation when I was growing up Quaker. If I had done QVS right out of college, I wouldn't have known much more than anyone who was coming into QVS who wasn't a Quaker. So I think there's, people come with different expectations and different experiences, but I think that the relationships built in the house and then in the meetings where people are going on a regular basis on first days are where that experimentation happens. So I don't know if I really totally answered your question. We have certain things we hope people will learn. So we do a peer clearness committee process on a regular basis. That's part of the spiritual formation, meeting with spiritual nurturers, going to meeting for worship, learning Quaker business practices. So there's like certain practices that we try to engage in and teach. But like I said, I think you could grow up Quaker and not really have a great understanding of that. You could have a great understanding of that, but be challenged by what does it look like in the context of QVS, because it might be really different than what it looked like, at your yearly meeting or at your monthly meeting. So I think the key is probably for everyone to bring an open mind and be open to learning new things about Quaker practice, even if you think you know everything there is to know about Quaker practice. And if you feel like you don't know anything, that's not a bad starting place either, because you're going to dive in and have a lot of experience and a lot of support in that.
Anybody else? Do we have any questions from the QVS folks? there's a lot of older adults who are speaking, I noticed.
Hi, my name's Tom Jenick, and I guess my experience has been, or similar experience has been as a VISTA volunteer in 1970 in North Philadelphia, which I'd have to say was possibly the most transformative year I've spent ever, really. But I'm wondering, my question would be, I mean, I have a whole bunch of questions, but one is how have you managed expectations between the volunteer and what they would expect from the placement they have, what the placement may have, what expectations they may have had of the volunteer. And I mean, I found that was a really difficult issue. I mean, of 10 people who became VISTA volunteers with me, I was the only one that finished a year. And 50% of the people in VISTA generally at that time didn't finish a year. And so there were lots of, and I'd say I was a community organizer in the last meeting that I held, nobody showed up. And I just, struggled a lot with that. I mean, years later, I found that, yes, I did have some influence on a lot of people that, I would not have known at the time. I think that's often the case with teachers. So anyway, I guess my question would be like, how do you manage expectations? How have you dealt with people who've been possibly disappointed? And I imagine some of that has to do with the selection process. And then also, what kinds of things are you doing to help people just figure out, for some, it may be the first job they've had. I mean, oftentimes getting along with your coworkers is one of the hardest things. and the living experience. How do you manage the households that how do you help people with that?
Yeah, well, I was going to say, it sounds like you have a pretty good understanding of the challenges of a QVS year. Yes. Well, I think one thing that distinguishes QVS and programs like ours from, I don't know the details of your experience, but like, for example, AmeriCorps, which is another popular service program, right? For the most part, AmeriCorps volunteers are not living in intentional community together. They might if they're working that out on their own, but it's not a built-in part of the program in most cases. And there's also not a built-in staff person who is there to support you. There's not a built-in spiritual community that's there to support you. So I think that for QVS, now it's not to say that people don't still struggle in their service work placements. That's part of, hey guys, you're all gonna struggle in your work placements. That is part of the experience, some more than others. For the service organizations that we've had longer partnerships with and we know supervisors well, we've had years of working on those relationships and figuring out what works for fellows and what doesn't work and what works for the organizations. For organizations that are newer partners to us, we're still working that out. So there's a whole bunch of different experiences that fellows are gonna have with your service work. But I think that the difference for us, for QVS, from AmeriCorps and from other programs, is that there's so much built-in support. So if a fellow is struggling at work, they have all of their housemates that they can talk to. They have their staff or their local coordinator. So we have staff in each city working directly with fellows. They have their spiritual nurturer. They have national staff. They have a local support committee of local Quakers. So there's tons of people who are part of the system to support them. And some of that support, like you said, for lots of people, this will be, I assume, your first job. It has been for many QVS fellows in the past. And so some of the support we provide is like, yeah, it's hard to like work a 40-hour work week and then come home and have to cook dinner. And so let's like help each other through that and think about ways to make that work. So all of what you said is definitely part of the experience. And yeah, I guess that would just be my response, is that we have so much built-in support to help people through that. And we have regular evaluations and check-ins with their site supervisors, with their local coordinator, with them. So there's lots of support. And it doesn't make it easy in every case, or, there's going to be struggle and there's going to be challenge, but hopefully with that community, intentional community, and the support, it makes a big difference. Zenaida.
Hi, Christina. Okay. My question is how did being at seminary school solidify your leading? I feel like I have more questions, but I'll probably ask you later.
Huh, that's it. I don't know if anyone's ever asked me that question. Well, it solidified it, I guess, in the sense, so I feel like my time in seminary, I mean, I was already working on starting QVS, so it wasn't, so that was like already part of my life, so I was able to, use that experience of seminary in a way that benefited that leading, if that makes sense. So, like, I chose to write this thesis, which I gave you to read, about the history of Quaker service and like digging into stuff that I knew was like really important for me to understand if we were going to start this organization and I was going to lead it. I needed to have this information and I was interested in it, so I was able to use the resources of seminary, of the school, and amazing professors and amazing people who were interested in the things I was interested in too, and helped me figure out how to talk about it and all that stuff. It was also while I was in seminary that I connected to this network of other faith-based service leaders, faith-based service program leaders. I was still in seminary when I was just like a long story, but I was introduced to somebody who was like, oh, I'm part of this thing, and oh, you're starting a Quaker program, you should come to this meeting. And that was like, if I hadn't been introduced to that network, it probably would have taken much longer to start things. So it kept feeling like my experience there was, there was never anything that happened that made me say, oh, I'm not interested in this anymore, I want to do this other thing. It was all like, yeah, this is still really what I want to do, and the experiences that I was having in seminary and what I was studying was giving me a deeper and a richer grounding for that, if that makes sense, but it never kind of took me on a different path.
Hello. So, I loved hearing you talk about how flexible and nimble, I think you said, the organization has been able to be, and how especially a lot of the staff members are quite young and sort of like very active with current things going on. That's allowed you, I think, to be even more flexible. But I'm wondering if you could talk about maybe just an example of a time when you received feedback or like challenge maybe from one of the fellows or someone else that might have been like in shifting away from something that you held as a really crucial, like critical belief that you were not willing to like compromise on or make a change in.
I'm looking at Hillary because there's one I don't know if I want to talk about. There's a lot. I'm just trying to think through which ones. All right. Okay. All right. Let's just put it out there. You'll hear about it soon enough anyway because you're in Boston. So, so let's see how much to say. So the first year of the Boston program, which was not this past year but the year before, this is a long story, which we can tell you all later the details of. But basically, the gist of it is that some of the Boston fellows were organizing in their work life. One person was organizing for a $15 an hour minimum wage for Massachusetts in the work life. But then that became an inspiration to organize for $15 an hour wage for QVS. Like, they wanted us to pay them $15 an hour as part of their QVS year. And it's more complicated than that. Like, it's much more complicated than that. But basically, it was sort of an organizing campaign against QVS to compensate them at a higher rate. It was very challenging for lots of us. And what it sort of came down to was like, what is the model of QVS? Like, are we are we an organization that's sort of like a job placement organization where we help you find social justice jobs and then you get paid for them, like at an appropriate fair wage? That's one model, and that was sort of a little bit of what they were advocating for, but that isn't the QVS model. The QVS model is this very different thing where you're committing to a year of service, and you're committing to living in an intentional community on a small stipend, and you're signing up for obviously not making $15 an hour, but being compensated in other ways through your house and your support from staff and all this other stuff. So it was really it was like a question of like, what is the QVS model, and do we want to change the QVS model? Like, is this an argument that we think is important enough to really think, you know, should we change our models so that our participants are compensated at what might be perceived as a more fair rate? That like we, you know, yeah, we support minimum wage, so should we do that for our fellows? So that all of those conversations, and I mean, it went to the board. I'm looking at Terrence because Terrence Williams is on our board, and it went to the board level. It was a conversation that we had at the board level, and I think you know, we were pretty clear from the beginning that no, we weren't. We pretty clear about who we were and that we weren't going to change the model, but we took it seriously enough to have a board meeting about it and, you know, discuss what it meant and where people were coming from and why was that something they were pushing for. And part of their concern, which was something we did want to make changes in the organization, part of their concern was how can QVS be more accessible to people from lower income backgrounds? And, you know, do you have to have a big savings account to do QVS? Is QVS only for people of privilege? So that concern was really, really important. Their particular suggestion or demand about how we address that concern was not one that we were willing to do, but addressing that concern in other ways is something that we are really committed to doing, and we have been doing, and we're continuing to do. So, I mean, actually, that is a pretty good example because it was really hard and it was really challenging, but it did cause us to say, like, who are we? What are our core values? And actually, we do want to address this concern. We just don't want to do it by throwing out our whole model. Is that a fair assessment, Terrence?
I have a chance for only one more question.
So my question sorry, is this close enough? My question has to do with the word service, and it's a word that comes up often in QVS, and I'm excited about that, but I also think it's kind of a loaded term, and I'm sure we're all coming at it with different ideas of what service means, what it does look like, what it should look like. And I'm just curious if you could talk a little bit about how QVS as an organization and or you personally conceptualizes what service is.
Oof, thank you for that question. Yeah, it's a great question, and obviously, I mean, it's like in the name of our organization, Quaker Voluntary Service. So it's part of who we are. I can't quote it right off the top of my head, but QVS has 4 core values, service being one of them, and we have some language in that core value about kind of what our understanding of service is, having to do with mutuality and, you know, recognizing that, like you said, the term service can be really loaded and can have negative connotations. Same with the word volunteer. Voluntary is also in our name, but we did stop calling you all volunteers for some of those reasons. Something I didn't really talk about in this talk, but one of the concepts that's been really important to me in thinking about QVS and Quaker history of service is what Rufus Jones called prophetic service. And so the way that he talked about that and the way that I understand that we are at least aspirationally living that, obviously not accomplishing this in all cases, but the idea being that you know, we're engaging in relationship with people and with systems. So we're not only doing direct service that's just engaging directly with people who need service, but we're also not only engaging in systems so that there's no personal relationship. So that I think it's about how do we engage systems and people? How do we be in real relationships with real people so we understand what's going on in people's lives, but how do we also work to change systems so that we're not just putting a Band-Aid on whatever a problem might be. I think it's also about encountering brokenness in the world that helps us understand our own brokenness. That, you know, we don't have answers, we're not fixing things, we're engaging as human beings, we're saying, here's where my pain is, where is your pain, here's my brokenness, where's your brokenness, and how can we be in relationship together? That's my personal answer, and I think part of the experience of QVS for fellows is digging into that question, like, what does that mean for you? And your site placement agencies might have a definition of that you love. They might have a definition of that you don't love. And so that's also part of the experience, is like the organization, so QVS, but then the organization that you're working for, like, how do they perceive justice? How do they perceive service? Is that an organization that you would continue working for, or maybe not? Maybe you love their analysis, maybe you don't love it. It's 11 months, so you're going to be able to learn a lot, you know, either way. And I think that it's mixed. I think we work with organizations that you know, you might love and that you might not. So I think that there's definitions of that at many levels, that I think that's always shifting. Our understanding of that is always shifting. But that's a brief answer.
Thank you for the brief answers and for the very thoughtful ones you've given us. Let's give it up for, yay, Christina. We wish you all the best of luck and spirit-led service as that develops in the experiment of finding out what truth is for you in your place, your homes, and in your meetings. But we wish you a great deal of luck in that endeavor. Lena.
Anyone who wants to do physical labor.
You can really be of service, but we only need one or two. And I would like to invite the rest of you to go and have some refreshments out in the anteroom while we try and set up for meeting for worship tomorrow morning.